Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, D. Reiser. Thank you, D. Reiser, for being a patron. Tony's got the dad idea, Tony. Tony's got the bad idea for this week. Tony, what are we learning about today?
We are going to be talking about the Salem Witch Trials.
I have heard of this. I think lots
this
of people have heard
this one's kind of a big bad idea. Like it's not like some of these obscure ones we've been talking about. Also want to say thank you to Jackie Permienter for recommending this topic.
Arguably, the press is worse than the actual event. I mean, compared to, like, some other things that happened in history that killed many thousands or even millions of people.
Yeah, but we're, like, sometimes we cover things of large scale, some things we cover of small scale. And whenever I was doing the research on this, I found that there was a lot of more witch hunting happening in Germany and places like that in the 1400s than this. But this is still very much a small town in complete chaos. So we decided to cover it today.
All right, hit me with it.
Alright, the Salem Witch Trials is a bit of widespread hysteria that brewed the American colonies in the 1690s. While it wouldn't carry the massive death counts seen in places like Germany, which topped well over 600 supposed witches and warlocks murdered, it would become a notorious story of crying wolf and superstition taken too far. Most people have heard about the reputation of Salem, or perhaps some of the tests that went into discovering these witches, but few knew how the trials actually worked or how several young girls kicked off this whole bout of madness. My main question is always going to be if they believed what was happening to them, if they made up their afflictions, or somewhere in between. Either way, the momentum of their actions would lead to the deaths of 20 people and to the trials of around 200.
So, they tried 200 people and found 190 of them not guilty for being witches?
There was a lot of weirdness with these trials, because the only way to save yourself was to confess being a witch and then to name others. Oh. So it kind of became one of those where...
It's like a musical chairs of Are You a Witch?
Yes, very much so. And it was rare for them to be able to like put on the full conviction, especially after some of the hangings started and people started losing their taste for it. It all started in 1692 when 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams started having raging fits. They would contort their bodies and scream for hours, writhing as doctors and ministers watched. They also would hurl things, make gutturals and strange noises, and generally just look completely insane. Elizabeth's father was Samuel Parris, who was the town's minister and Abigail's uncle. After William Griggs, the local doctor, gave them the catch-all diagnosis of bewitchment, many other girls in the village started having similar symptoms.
Man, you gotta love a time when the doctor could just be like, must be a witch, man. I don't know. That's all I got for you.
It's like, did we bleed them? It didn't work? Bewitchment.
It's gotta be tough, though, if you're, like, the minister of the village, right? You're the dude who's in charge of talking to God, and all of a sudden your daughter is maybe demon-possessed and or in league with the devil in some way. That's a problem.
It definitely is. It's a bad PR move whenever you're talking about your own ministries. And all of this was happening in Salem Village, which was a short trek from the larger and more prosperous Salem town. Like any pairs of cities, there was an odd political and personal rivalry between the two towns. Puritan society was odd in that these rivalries rarely became violent, instead of fights and honor disputes that were common of the time. Instead, they just sued the ever-loving hell out of each other. Like, it was just how they, resolve disputes. And a lot of this came down to, Salem town not wanting to, or Salem Village not wanting to have to pay extra to have a minister and do all these other little tariffs, and there was just a lot of weird rivalry between the two towns.
So, let me get this straight. You have these two Puritan towns who are suing each other to death over the tax that pays the minister's salary?
Yeah, and Salem Village kind of refused to pay that, so they lost their two former ministers because they just weren't paying them to be there. And it's like, yeah, if you're in a godly profession, you're not supposed to, Joel Osteen it. But I think you do need your living expenses paid.
Yeah, you don't have to starve because you're reading the Bible to people.
Yeah, it's like even the Jesuits get to eat.
I don't think they're one of the ones that swears off of food. There's other orders?
No, I'm saying the Jesuits make a vow of poverty.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sidetrack.
Let's see.
Let's get back on with the witches.
Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams were brought to the courthouse along with Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Mary Walcott and Mary Warren. Which, by the way, there's a lot of names that are just going to run together later. So I'm going to be talking in some broader terms. Like, if there's something specific that happens with somebody, I'll bring that up. But otherwise, it's just going to be like lists of names that don't matter.
Okay.
But all of these girls had experienced these spasms, these fits of rage, this demonic possession or affliction. Some people thought that they had like demonic spirits in them. Some thought that this was just the after effects of it. Some thought that this was the effects of spells put on them using what are called poppets, which are these like just a little puppet, like a voodoo doll style thing that witches would use to influence their victims.
Allegedly.
Yes, allegedly.
We're not here with proof of witch existence on our Salem Witch Trials bad idea episode.
I mean, if we had some proof of that, that would be pretty awesome for this episode.
I will say, if you're in this time or any time dealing with this kind of issue, it's pretty concerning, right? If my kid was laying on the ground, like having a screaming fit for you said 2 or 3 hours at a time, that they would do this?
Yeah, sometimes longer than that. Sometimes it would be days.
Where they're just like curled, like with paroxysms of rage or grief, or maybe it's some kind of like seizure-like thing. There's good
the thing is, people knew
concerned.
of epilepsy at the time, and the doctors were saying that it was fits beyond that of like epileptic rage. So like they understood what a seizure was. They understood like things like that because they'd seen it in people. So it wasn't that they were entirely ignorant of things like epilepsy. It's just that this was a level beyond that. Even in front of the magistrate, and a gathered audience, these fits continued to grow, and more young women would be afflicted. Essentially, in these courthouses, they were still doing their contortions. They were still screaming. They were doing all of this, and the court started to get very, very concerned. Whenever they could get one of these girls to calm down enough, the first accusations started to spew from their mouths. They labeled the Paris family Caribbean slave Tituba, the homeless beggar Sarah Good, and the poor elderly Sarah Osborne. Good and Osborne would vehemently deny their status as witches, but Tituba would eventually confess, saying that she and many others had been acting in the service of the devil.
This, again, is a person who is a slave, who has been brought here and probably just found out about the devil, but I guess she's all on board.
I'm not entirely sure. There's not a lot known of the childhood of Tituba. Like, she might have had some of the more island religions growing up. So, like, there's a reason why she already knew how to practice some of this stuff, but she definitely was much better studied in dark magic than the other people. Like, this was sort of a notorious thing that she had been a part of. Like, she actually was known to practice these spells. And here's a weird one. And this is something where I got conflicting sources. Like, one of the documentaries said that this was a man named John Indian. Others said that it was Tituba. But the thing that she had tried to do whenever she heard that there was some sort of witching happening was she tried to make a witch cake, which is where you take the urine from one of the victims, which she was the slave of that house, so she was the one that would have access to chamber pots, and baked it into a cake and fed it to a dog, thinking that the dog would actually be able to go and find the person that was responsible for the bewitching. So when she confessed, she basically said that she was trying to consult the devil to expose the devil.
Man, yeah, I know there's sort of like the obvious, why were these people crazy back then? But hearing all these details, I'm kind of like, yeah, I get it. Like, you don't know that. You haven't heard of science hardly that much, right? And your doctors are saying...
Yeah, they didn't have, like, a hard scientific method. Like, it was a time of superstition. You had the Wabakani Indians, like, at your door, basically. Like, there's a lot of pressure going on in this era.
Yeah, and your doctors are...
And there's also some physiological reasons why these girls might have gone into these spasms, and we're going to get into that a bit later.
But you do actually have somebody. It's not like completely made up that there are people out there who are not like doing the Puritan Christian thing. They have their own religion from before, and they're doing their thing with that whole deal. And so if you're a Puritan, you've got stuff you can't explain, your doctors can't explain it. They're saying this definitely isn't just like an epileptic seizure. And then on top of that, you legitimately have somebody who is doing whatever their religious practice is that's not your own. Like, it's understandable up till now, even if still horrifying what I know is going to happen, like why these people got to the way they got.
Yeah, and like they also picked like the first 3 people that were accused were very much like the people you would suspect. Like Sarah Good was a homeless beggar that very rarely attended the services in the town, often like lied and stole from people and just was kind of a problem around town. And Sarah Osborne was similar in that she was not like a church-going woman and she was a little bit bitter. A lot of people couldn't understand her because she spoke mostly Gaelic. Like it's kind of understandable why these people were accused, especially Tituba, because she was one that would practice these magics, and she was well versed in books like the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a book from the 1400s that was used to determine and understand how to catch and purge witches, which actually came around like right when the printing press was invented. So you had a lot of like the Gutenberg Bibles, then you had a lot of these books of the Malleus Maleficarum, which is one of the coolest like names. I love that name.
It sounds really cool. This person sounds really interesting, at least. I don't know that I'm excited about her delving into attempted witchcraft at this time when people are really freaking out about witches. But
definitely not.
I mean, she's a slave who knows how to read, and I'm assuming this book is probably not written in English.
No, this book was written in Latin. I'm not sure if somebody read it to her. Like, I couldn't... Like I said, there's a lot of lack of details whenever it comes to Tituba. I think she probably could read because of her personal knowledge on this. But kids would come up to her and ask questions about witches, and she would talk about things that were very taboo in Puritan culture, about how witches derived their powers from selling their souls or doing sex acts with demons. And I could imagine why that's going to draw some real attention in Puritan times.
Yeah, I don't want the crazy lady down the street. Although again, let's point a big bullseye on the people who owned another human also. But still, like anybody who's hanging around who's telling my kids about how to have sex with demons, I'm gonna not want them to be saying that stuff. I'll probably walk down a different road. And you mentioned earlier the first 2 girls that start having these fits are 9 and 11. Is that sort of the average age, or we get into older people?
Now, the girls that came after seem to be mostly young teenagers. Okay. And Tituba likely confessed knowing that there would be more leniency in a confession than a conviction. She was very willing to name other people in town and the village in order to save herself. Arrests started happening all over both Salem town and Salem village. Even priests like George Burroughs did not hold enough clout to save himself from the accusations. Many well-liked and supposedly godly members of the towns ended up in these prisons, and it just so happens that the people that were most vocal about not believing that these girls were actually serious about being afflicted by these were the ones that were accused most often, even if they were part of the church.
I mean, if you were in that time, I can see the argument, right? It's like, the argument would be, well, you're just trying to draw attention away from yourself, saying like, oh, they're not really there. They don't actually, obviously they have something wrong with them. What are you trying to hide?
Well, there's a lot of people that think these girls specifically just did it for attention, like that they were just bored. But I think that might be something that happened later, and if you were to all of a sudden stop whenever like all this was happening, then you could probably be accused of witchcraft yourself, or of false allegations, or a lot of different things. So like once you're kind of in, you're in all the way.
There's also the fact, I think modern people are somehow different than people of the day, because you can't just discount things like this by saying, they knew what they were doing. I mean, you got other historical events like the dancing fever, and during the Great Awakening, there would be like fits of barking that would come on people, and it's... I don't know what
weird things that happen with human psychology,
right?
Especially if you've got a deep-seated faith society like this. Like I've been to churches where people have talked in tongues. I see people do things that are very bizarre in my eyes, that just kind of flow through them. Like it could be like just the base psychological, like you just fall into it and you run with it. So I think that there's a little bit of that here, but one of the things that is most theorized is that these girls were actually suffering at the beginning from ergot poisoning.
Okay.
Which ergot poisoning is whenever a type of mold grows on rye, and this is a very hallucinogenic substance. So imagine that you're having just normal bread, and you all of a sudden start feeling super paranoid, and it keeps progressing and getting worse and worse and worse. So you go from being just a little bit paranoid to actually starting to see things on the ceiling, see things in the shadows, to feel that there's a lot of like demons crowding around you. And I think that that is a very that seems like a pretty substantial thing to happen to these people to make them feel like they're bewitched. Psychedelics are a hard thing, and if you have absolutely no context for what's going on, it would have to feel like insanity or possession.
Yeah, I was gonna say they might have jumped just past insanity. Insanity at the time, the only thing they like really fully considered insane was if you just couldn't function in society. If you were so crazy that you had to be locked up. Although like, there's a lot of debate these days about how much stuff you had to do to get locked up, and there was people who would just, put people in insane prisons who were, they didn't like them. But you don't have as much context for mental health today, for mental health at the time as you would today, where you would just say, oh, maybe I'm having some kind of weird brain issue. Like it was a reasonable thing to think maybe there's a demon.
Yeah, and like people who were put into asylums most often were kind of invalids because of how bad their mental conditions got. And I'm sure some people that weren't got put in there because that was just corruption and everything. That still happens today a little bit. There's definitely a bad ideas episode to be done about lobotomies someday. We'll get to that. We were talking about how Tituba confessed, and this was one of the odder things about these trials. If you confessed, you basically were set free, you were excommunicated from the church, the community might disown you, but you weren't hung or drowned or any other number of horrific tortures that seem to happen. And this is always odd to me, because if you're worried about a witch in your community, and they confess to being a witch, and then you just let them go off on their own and isolate them from your town, that seems like a really good way to get a witch more pissed off and actually do more to you. So it always seemed a little bit strange to me that the people that got to go free were the confessed ones, and the people that tried to prove their faith and tried to prove that they were honorable people were the ones that would end up being hung.
I hear you on that, but I also think it's important to remember that at a time like this, when you're essentially dependent on the community for survival, unless you want to scrounge, in the woods for roots and stuff. And the community and the church and the government and everything is all twined together. The idea of excommunicating and putting out of the town someone who has done something, that's a not insubstantial punishment.
No, it's not. Like, there's a pretty good chance you're not going to last the winter without some help, especially if you're one of the elderly people. Like, there are a lot of people in their 70s and 80s here, which, if you're at that point in the 1600s, you're like a slight cold away from death.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting. Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about the prisons and everything, because so many people were getting arrested. These were very different types of prisons. That wasn't sponsored by the state. If you were put in prison, you had to continually pay for your own amenities. Do you want some new straw that isn't infested with bugs? That'll cost you. You want your daily bread? Better have your own funds or someone to pay for you outside of there. This was part of why the elderly Sarah Osborne would die in jail before she could even stand trial. There were only 18 hangings, but I think about 20 people died because of the conditions that were on here, one of which is a more grisly death that we'll get to in a little bit when they were trying to draw a confession out of him.
Yeah. People complain about the commissary prices in prisons today, and that's not to say that's not illegitimate, but at least you get food.
In May of 1692, the newly appointed governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, ordered the establishment of a special court of oyer and terminer, which means to hear and to decide on the witchcraft cases for Suffolk, Essex, and Middlesex counties. Now that they had a formal court and several magistrates to run it, the accusations started to carry deadly weight. The first woman to be hanged was Bridget Bishop. She had been accused of witchcraft after the death of her husband several years prior, as well as having poppets, which were little dolls used in spells. It was believed that she had a third nipple, which was a surefire mark of a witch, and was used to feed demonic wards. Upon further inspection, this was not true. It was just some dry skin.
Everything about that is okay.
Yeah, the evidence mounted as more than 10 people levied accusations of casual witchcraft against them. Everything from bewitching their cattle to bewitching a child to death. She also lied about some insubstantial things on the stand which did not help her case. Even though she was not the very first accused, many believe that the court wanted an easy case in order to set the precedent of what was going to happen. With her prior history, they knew that they would be able to reach a conviction even without confession. And let's go back to the Devil's Mark real quick. The Devil's Mark was supposedly some sort of mark, a mole, a skin tag, something that was out of the ordinary on a supposed witch, which is where a ward of demons would come and suckle from to pull spiritual essence basically, and to feed them. It was a weird little piece of paranoia that people really believed at the time. So if you had a weird skin tag or something like that, people might accuse you of being a witch.
Okay. That sounds like a bad time.
Many of the trials in the future would rely on a form of evidence called spectral evidence, in which a spectral version of the accused would appear in front of townfolks to do their evil bidding. Even Cotton Mather, who wrote many books on witchcraft and the disposal of witches, said that this was thin at best, especially since the devil would be able to project whoever they wanted, including angels, into this spectral form. But people used it anyway. Cotton Mather was kind of a strange man in that he was very scientific, but also held a very deep belief in Satan and angels, witches, and believed that if you didn't believe in all of this, you were basically denying the existence of God. Either way, he presided over some of these trials and offered assistance when he could, and tried to make it so that the evidence was a little bit more substantial.
So this guy's on board with there being witches, but he's like, we gotta figure out if they are witches, scientifically. We can't just have people accusing other people willy-nilly, you morons.
Yeah, he's basically saying, oh, you saw a projection of this girl at 3 in the morning of a night and you thought it was her in the dark? Well, that's not exactly enough to really convict this person.
And it's a good point, right? If Satan, the father of lies, can make a projection of anybody he wants to, why would he make the projection of the actual person that is gonna be the witch? I'm on Cotton Mather's side here. That is pretty flimsy evidence, quote unquote.
Yeah, and he and his father, I can't remember his father's name. It was something really weird, like Inference or something like that. They said that they would rather see 10 witches go free than one innocent burned, and he was trying to make sure that that was the case here. He didn't have a lot of success with that, but he would have some.
All right. It's weird to be, sympathetic to these people who, on one hand, are so different from us in, the way that they see the world, and yet, you can look at him and be like, man, this guy's doing the best he can. He doesn't believe
I can see the internal
everything.
Logic of what's happening here.
Right.
It's not that it's nonsensical. It's nonsensical from our point of view because we have such a secular view of the world, and there isn't really a whole lot of possession and witchcraft happening in a visible way in our culture. I mean, there's a lot of witches out there. I went to a magic store the other day where they had all the different hexes you could put on Donald Trump. There's a weird subculture for this.
But you didn't walk in and immediately start seizing up and foaming at the mouth. And neither has Donald Trump, unless you think his entire presidency is the result of a curse that was put on him by a witch. It seems like those things probably aren't working that well.
There was also the touch test, in which the afflicted would be touched by the supposed witch during a fit. If their fit stopped, then it was known that the witch was in control of these victims. So we were talking about the girls earlier that are having these spasms and fits, and they would be forced... The accused would be forced to touch them, and if all of a sudden this fit stopped, they knew that person was a witch, and they would be able to get a conviction with some other evidence, usually that spectral evidence we talked about earlier. The next test was also using the Lord's Prayer. If a person could utter the prayer without stopping, it was believed that they were pure. Unfortunately, one of the victims spoke Gaelic, and when asked to speak in English, stuttered over certain passages, and she was hung for it. Minister George Burroughs also countered this because whenever he was on the gallows, he gave a very impassioned speech about his innocence and ended it by completely speaking the Lord's Prayer. At this point, Cotton Mather said that the devil must have been behind him giving him the words, and that even the devil could cite scripture for his purpose, and they killed him anyway.
Okay. So these guys probably aren't listening to Cotton Mathers that much.
Yeah, not really. Apparently people were kind of upset about that one because he did give such an impassioned speech. I mean, you're already a minister, so you know how to probably be a decent orator. And to, when your life's on the line and you're trying to influence change, I imagine it was pretty intense. Then they, basically cut him down, threw him into a shallow grave where his leg was sticking up out of the ground. So, they did not treat him very well afterwards. The torture and seeking of confession was creative as well. One of the more notorious was that of Giles Corey, whose wife, just a few months prior, had been hung as a witch. He was given the peine forte de Dieu, in which they tried to draw a confession out of him by stacking rocks on his prone body.
This is one of the ones I've heard of. The death by crushing, and this one in particular.
Yeah, this is one that probably a lot of people have heard of, because over the course of 2 days, these giant stones were piled on him, usually 15 to 20 kilos at a time. One of his last utterings would be, "more weight," in which he employed his captors to kill him. Eventually, he would die of suffocation under the weight of these stones.
I guess there's worse ways to go.
Yeah, the thing that bothers me about that is the 2 days under the stones. And the thing is, he was basically protesting the trials. He had already lost his wife to this madness, and he did not, he put in his innocent plea, no one believed him, so they ended up putting him under these rocks to get a confession out of him, which torture for confession really means very little for truth, but it was just the way people did things back then, and occasionally the way they still do things now. Most of the more creative methods of execution and confession were used in other witch hunts across the world. Things like the drowning test, where they would tie a rock to somebody and see if they floated in a river, and if they floated, they were a witch, and if they drowned, they were innocent. Burning at the stake, all that sort of stuff, I thought was actually part of the Salem Witch Trials, but that didn't end up happening in these cases.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know you said you weren't going to talk about it, but I wasn't fully aware that this is taking place within a context of this sort of, I was going to say global, but at least Western swell of witch paranoia that's happening throughout most of, like you said, Germany and a lot of different places that are kind of having this grip them. Did you get any insight into why this particular era in history might have been rife for that?
Oh, in the 1400s, it was rife for it because of, like I said, the printing press. The second most popular book, other than the Bible at the time, was the Malleus Maleficarum. So all of a sudden, people had access to this information. And it's like whenever you read, the psychopath test, you start seeing psychopaths in everybody. Whenever you start seeing, all these little things that could be witchcraft, and you all of a sudden feel like you're an expert on it because you've had access to this information, it just kind of blew up. And it's usually tied to, bad economic conditions or highly stressful times, there were Native American raids happening in some of these villages. Things like that just tended to draw the paranoia out of people. So I think it was a mix of stress, economic conditions, and more. Probably the most strange of all of these witch trials happened, I believe it was in Germany, but I need to check it again, where these groups of nuns basically got caught in giant orgies and then claimed that they were under witchcraft, and it just turned into a very, very strange series of events that got many top government officials hung. So I've got some notes on that. I'm trying to remember the names. There's probably an episode there later, because that's actually a fascinating story.
Yeah, that synopsis of the whole thing just sounds amazing and real. Yeah, I'm very curious now about that story, but I guess we should stick with this one for now.
The Salem Witch Trials were a lot more of a cold justice situation than the more impassioned burning of witches. They did lead to 4 separate days of hanging, where by the end of September 1692, 18 people had died. I think it was 5 men and 13 women, something like that, and you can count some of the peripheral ones that died in the prisons or died of crushing as part of the victims and bring it up to 20. Many of the accused were given reprieves because they were pregnant at the time as well, otherwise the number would have been much higher. After this point, many received death sentences but were pardoned from the sentences, or they were simply never carried out. It seemed like the need for blood in these communities had been sated. And when you're talking about communities of several hundred people, to lose 20 in such a violent manner had to have been pretty traumatic. Especially when a lot of these people were like ordained members of churches and very strong community members.
Yeah, I can't imagine what this is, because obviously there's the negative side, right? Everybody's like, why were these people so crazy? But they were also human people who were friends with these guys, and even if they actually believed that they might have been witches, especially when it spirals out from the outsiders, right? Because initially it's like this crazy lady who's homeless and this slave who we don't care about and actually is kind of weird a little bit, but
yeah, actually knows about witchcraft.
Yeah, but once you get out into like the community as a whole, even if you are part of this, like there's definitely demons and they're they're in league with them. It still sucks to then like have to deal with the fallout of, oh great, we've crushed some people that we like under a big pile of rocks.
In January of 1697, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting for the tragedy of Salem and the witch trials. The court later deemed these trials unlawful, and the leading justice Samuel Sewell publicly apologized for his role in the process. The damage to the community lingered, however, even after the Massachusetts colony passed legislation restoring the good names of the condemned and providing financial restitution for their errors in 1711. So there were attempts to try to do this. They even went back and added headstones on consecrated ground because anybody that was hung here was not allowed to be buried in what was considered a Christian burial. And it wasn't enough for the victims that happened there. But this is mostly a story of what happens when kind of mass hysteria goes too far and you don't have people that are going to step up and stop this from happening. But it is what we talked about, where at the time you can kind of see why this grew so fast, but it turned into a neighbor versus neighbor situation. It turned into a town versus town. It turned into accusations on accusations on accusations where people were trying to save their own skin. And it just was not a way to seek justice in any sort of real sense. So these Salem Witch Trials were a bad idea for many, many, many ideas. But I think more than anything, it was more about the harshness of what they considered justice for people that would not confess even under duress.
And it's, I think, worthwhile today to consider, we don't believe in at least as much. I mean, I'm a religious person, so I believe in the existence of supernatural things. But that's not my first instinct when I see somebody acting weird. But we do still have things that we assume about other people, that we can know what their inner thoughts are, that we can judge hearts by what we see on the outside, even if deeds may not necessarily be bad. We'll say, well, but they're actually bad. We have these kinds of judgments that we make even today. Even if we don't believe in demons and witches, we still got to watch out for the untestable accusation that can occur and
Definitely.
really wreck people's lives still.
Yeah. And that's actually why in the 50s, whenever The Crucible was written, it was written about a love story during the Salem Witch Trials, but was actually more of a story about McCarthyism and the ability to just accuse people without proof of what was going on, during the communist witch hunt. So it applies in modern times just as well as it does back then, where you really can't, like you said, see into the hearts of these people and understand what's going on.
And it's easy also to look back and be critical, but, you brought up McCarthyism. It's worth pointing out there actually was a danger of communism at the time. A lot of the people...
Yeah, that's one thing Dan Carlin talked about, is that, it's hard to express the feeling of an era whenever you're talking about McCarthyism, the paranoia of of complete mutually assured destruction. People look back on it and it's that was absolutely stupid, but people get caught up in these mindsets because usually there is a threat, even if the threat becomes overblown and is mostly paranoia.
Well, that, I think, about sums it up better than anything else could. Thank you guys so much for listening to our episode. If you enjoyed this and you are not subscribed on whatever platform you have listened to this on, we would encourage you to do that. I believe we're literally anywhere you could imagine getting a podcast. Spotify, Apple, iTunes. We're on YouTube with just the audio only stuff. So you can find us and subscribe to us, and we'd love for you to do that. And if you enjoy us, wherever you're getting this, if there's a review option or leave a comment, we would love for you to let other people know that you're enjoying this podcast. As always, if you have bad ideas you'd like us to cover, you can send those to badideasshow@gmail.com, and we will take a look at them. We'll see you guys next week with more bad ideas.
Bye, everybody.